Perfect.
Actually.
Perfect.
I mean, that is one insight I got from that book.
We
is
can
to
do it.
Everything 50, 40. I was doing quintiles to the end of time.
Made me
Yeah, it's
more
like
happy.
50,
And I was like, you know
between
what?
0
Why
and
keep
50%.
this? This is not good. This is just like, this is
I
complaint
was
wrong.
looking at the
This is just
quintile
rub that
breaks.
out.
I
Nobody
knew
needs
it,
to
but
know.
he gave me the strength to do it. So I just do
Keep the
all my
people in your
pension
ears.
stuff. It's bottom 90.
Start.
You know, and that it just changes.
I'm not first.
Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Deb Figart from the Richard Stockton College of New Jersey, and we're going to have a conversation this afternoon, very informal, quasi-formal, quasi-informal. The session is titled Policy Priorities in Response to Labor Flexibilization. And we have a wonderful panel that's going to engage in conversation, and the session ends at 2:15. But I would like to have a conversation where we end the conversation at about 1:45 p.m. and then invite you to also join this conversation about policy priorities in response to labor flexibilization. To my right, and I'm sorry that we
Should we
are
take
so far
affirmative
apart.
action and change?
I'm sure we don't belong to the union that allows us to move furniture in this hotel, so I'm so sorry about that.
Oh, but Teresa's
move
taking
chairs.
matters into her own hands.
Yes. Eileen, let's come.
Teresa and Eileen, just use the microphone when you speak. We'll pass down a mic if we can.
Yeah, we'll just use
because we're going to put this, this session is sponsored by the Association for Social Economics, and we're going to put this on our new ASE YouTube channel. The Association for Social Economics is a group that is very concerned with issues of values in economics, ethics, and justice is very important. So this wonderful panel, thanks to Ellen Mutari, the president of the association, for putting this together. To my right is Heather Boushey from the Center for Equitable Growth. Then we have Barbara Wiens-Tuers from Penn State University-Altoona. Then we have Teresa Ghilarducci from the New School. And we have Eileen Appelbaum from the Center for Economic and Policy Research. So the ASE sessions at this Allied Social Science Association's meeting opened up with a wonderful plenary by Guy Standing. And he talked about the precariat and labor market flexibilization over time. We're seeing trends toward the growth of part-time workers and temporary workers, even more than before, and contract workers and contingent labor, and all of these categories of people jumping from job to job to job to job. And Standing, as I mentioned, calls this the precaritization. And he has a book called The Precariat, and then a policy book about what to do with the precariat. So today we're exploring these trends and how we can respond in terms of public policy. So I'm going to ask the panelists some questions, and we're going to try to have a conversation. And I'm going to ask the panelists to keep their answers relatively short, and I would aim for about 3 to 4 minutes. And I have questions for individual panelists, I have questions for duos, and I have a couple of questions to throw out to all of you and have you weigh in on them. And I'll try to keep track of time. I'm going to open up with a question for Teresa. One of the markers of flexible labor markets is the underpinning of benefits such as employer-sponsored pensions that provide economic security for retirees. The title of your new book, Teresa, is When I'm 64, The Plot Against Pensions and the Plan to Save Them. So it's a wonderful long book, and we don't have time to go through the whole book, but briefly, can you tell us what is the plan to save pensions and build wealth for the American working class?
Right, just the preamble is the reason why the working class have lost a legitimate claim on retirement and have lost basically a stream of income for the rest of their lives in retirement is because of the precariousness of the labor market. There are correlates. So we know that there's probably an estimated 53 million Americans who within a couple of years' time, in any 2-year period, will be part of the, well, let's use Standing's words, of the precariat, their contingent labor. This counts Uber drivers, but it doesn't count actually the modern version of the 19th century way that a lot of working class women got income, which is by taking in boarders. So Airbnb is really the 19th century equivalent of what working class and middle class women did to get extra income. It doesn't count all that income from the sharing economy, but it is, the decline in retirement security is correlated with what Peter Capelli has called the shift away from training workers, that we're moving from a buy the labor rather than make the labor. So it's very important to realize that among the employees are becoming more precarious, even if they might be W-2 employees. And employers' response has not been to go back to the past 50 years and actually hire people for their potential and then train them for the job, but actually just to complain that they always have a perpetual labor shortage. This is especially galling in the information technology industry, with anybody over 40 is viewed as not available for labor. So I belabor that point, that this the rise of the contingent worker is also correlated with the rise of the untrained employee. And it's been correlated with a decline in the provision of pension plans, defined benefit plans, and the provision for only half the workforce of 401k plans. And 401k plans have unintended consequences for our retirement security for workers, but they certainly have an unintended consequence for employers. A 401k plan makes hiring an employee a big risk, because as the workforce ages, employers are finding that more and more people are not retiring. There was an influx of employees staying with their jobs in the Great Recession, and this was an accident for employers. Many of us work for universities where there are a lot of people who haven't retired because they're in TICREF, a form of a 401k plan. So I think many employers are going to rue the fact that they have 401k plans and have lost that important personnel tool to get 55-year-olds and 60-year-olds to retire. But one logical response is to not hire employees, but actually to hire temporary workers. So we have a big social problem. We have a coming retirement crisis. We have the middle class workers are facing poverty in old age, or near poverty in old age, like their parents and grandparents have never faced. So we are going, and all politicians know this, and if you poll Americans about what their biggest worry is, it's not health care and employment, it actually is retirement security. So now finally, to answer your question, my plan is very simple. It follows from the logic of the Social Security plan, which was the last response to a Great Recession, which is to mandate the payment of premiums for the contingency of old age. And I have proposed that we mandate a personal savings account for all employees, and importantly for this session, for all self-employed people. Just like we would have a much worse crisis if we didn't have a mandatory Social Security system. Every contingent worker we're worried about here, at least in America, this is the good news, has to pay a Social Security tax, self-employment Social Security tax. It's very progressive. And the reason why contingent workers file their income taxes, again, we should pat ourselves on the back. It's brilliant American social policy. This is the good news, is that we have an earned income tax credit that incents workers who are in this precariat to file an income tax. And when they file an income tax, they pay a self-employment tax to Social Security. It's hidden form of social insurance that we should actually be proud of, and it's something that guy standing doesn't quite see, because in Europe it's the opposite. The tax rates are very high, and the precariat don't pay taxes. But we have a brilliant intersection of the EITC with Social Security tax, and I just propose that on top of that, that workers save for their own retirement with a mandatory guaranteed retirement account.
Thank you very much. I can imagine already lots of follow-up questions for you about 401ks and this alternative. Here's a question for Eileen. Eileen, in your new book, Private Equity at Work, fantastic book, by the way, you examine the impact for labor of the commodification of companies. And what we mean by that, the commodification of companies, is businesses are now bought and sold just like any other commodity, or even parts of businesses are bought and sold like any other financial commodity, shortening time horizons and further separating management and ownership. How does this impact workers? What should we be doing to address this?
So there's actually a long answer to this question, which I will be giving in the next session over at the Lyra meetings. But I guess the short answer is to really focus on the use of debt. Debt is the lifeblood of the industry. These are called leverage buyouts. Leverage refers to levels of debt that are so high that they're essentially junk bond level. And it turns out that the answer is a little more complex than you might think, because there are, in fact, and we work hard in the book to find the good examples, there are, in fact, sorry. I'll switch it. So there are, in fact, small, relatively small private equity firms that specialize in particular industries. They know the industry really well, and they buy what are considered small establishments with a value of $300 million or less. So this is the middle market, what I consider to be the core of the middle market. And in these cases, you're basically buying family-owned businesses that, in many cases, do not have modern managers, no professionalization. A bookkeeper is using Quicken Books or something like that. They don't have an IT system. They don't know how to market nationally. And a private equity company can come in that situation. Because they're small, it can't really load them up with too much debt. That's the first thing to realize. If you don't understand it, when private equity firms buy companies with debt, the responsibility for repaying the debt is the company they bought. Mm-hmm. It's like you bought your neighbor's house, you own it, but they have to pay the mortgage. It's a good deal if you could get it. So what happens is, in these smaller companies, there's not that much in the way of assets that you can mortgage, and therefore the levels of debt are not much higher than they are in publicly traded companies. So debt makes a little bit of difference to the profitability for the private equity firm, but it really is these low-hanging fruit that you can improve the operation of the company. And in those cases, the outcomes are not necessarily bad for workers. Most of these, and a large number of deals go on here, but we're talking about small numbers of workers. You go from 75 to 350 workers. Then you have the big deals where the large companies come in, they take over a company that is publicly traded, that already has all of the modern anything you would want, but they have lots of assets that can be mortgaged, and they put 70% debt typically. We have examples where the debt level is as high as 82%. Caesars is about to go under because of all the debt that was put on it. Energy Futures Holdings did go under 82% debt. When the markets changed, you couldn't, there's no maneuverability. When those companies go under, thousands of workers lose their jobs. So we make hundreds of jobs where you have some good things happening, we lose thousands of jobs, and most of the money in private equity goes into these leverage buyouts of these big companies. And in that case, you're just doing financial engineering. There are no ways that you're going to easily do, because you have a very, very small time horizon, as you pointed out. They want to hold the companies for 3 to 5 years. There's not much you can do to a company that's already got modern whatever in a 3 to 5 year period. And so it's all about financial engineering, and it's all about having loaded them up with debt, and then somehow you have to make the debt payments. And so they are closing facilities, they are firing workers, they are cutting pay and benefits. If it's a unionized facility, they will usually negotiate with the union prior to buying it what the concessions are going to be. So, and if they can't get the concessions, they won't buy the company. So We have lots of examples, and certainly in all of the large companies like Caesars, like Energy Futures Holding, like Mervyn's Department Store, where thousands of workers either lose their jobs, have their pay cut, or in some other way suffer.
Thank you, Eileen. Heather,
Yes.
your center focuses on, quote, equitable growth, unquote. Would you briefly summarize what your center does and then comment on whether income inequality is contributing to our slow recovery from the Great Recession? And also, why does income inequality matter?
Wow, okay.
I know it's hard to do that.
If I have 4 minutes, yes. So let me just, I'm going to structure my answer by telling you about the center and touch on some of the ways that we've been thinking about the answers to those questions. So I'm heading a new center called the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, which is in Washington, D.C. We have 17 people now, which seems ginormous to me. We are focused on whether and how inequality affects economic growth and stability. And by that we mean, what are the ways in which the trends that we're seeing on the household side in terms of inequality in access to good jobs, to wages, in family income, in benefits, and sorry about that, so a wide array of ways of thinking about inequality, so not just income inequality, also wealth. But how do these growing gaps across families and individuals, how does that affect our economy more generally? How does it affect economic stability? How does it affect economic growth? You could frame it in terms of how does it affect economic competitiveness? And so that's our overarching question. And the way that we are going about investigating this is that we are a grant-making institution. We gave away $500,000 last year to 16 scholars. We have a request for proposals out. So thank you, Deb. This is like the perfect moment. I actually don't have the pile with me, but I know they're out and about someplace. But we have a call for papers out right now to get at whether and how inequality affects economic growth and stability. We only fund people affiliated with academic institutions. So if you're not at one, but you can find somebody at one to work with you, then we will be interested. And in our call, we are looking at research in 4 big buckets of thinking. Basically, there's a whole body of research that looks at whether and how inequality affects economic growth or stability that does sort of macroeconomic regressions. It just puts, growth on one side, inequality on the other, and looks to see what happens. And I've been to a number of conferences where we talk about these papers, and basically I think the consensus among economists is that it's very interesting and it's a full employment program for econometricians, but we're probably not ever going to come to like the perfect answer. And while that research is incredibly important, and we just did a very interesting event with Jonathan Ostry from the IMF, who's done work in this space a couple of weeks ago, we are actually targeting our scarce resources at actually looking at the mechanisms through which inequality could affect the economy. So the overall story is interesting, but I think the more interesting story, and critically, I think the way that we're going to convince policymakers about the import of inequality is to have stories to tell them about why it matters. Because if you sort of, pin all your hopes on one magic regression, somebody's going to come along and tell you that you've done it wrong, and there you go, it's a three-handed economist. But if you can give people a story about why inequality matters that's data-driven, then I think you really are. I think you're pushing the ball forward in terms of how people think. So we're looking in 4 basic areas, which is the same 4 basic areas, by the way, that we funded last year. As somebody who's always been in soft money, we are committed to doing the same thing each year, so people know what to expect. Kind of, we're changing on the margins, but trying to be very thoughtful about that. So the 4 areas briefly are essentially demand, human capital, entrepreneurship, and institutions. But to just give you a few sentences about each, on the demand side, the way that we're framing it this year is household balance sheets and macro stability. I've been on 3 panels at this conference on questions around that are just absolutely fascinating. What is it that we know about leverage, about how that played out across over the Great Recession, about how different debt, how much debt different families took on, how that affected our economy more generally. Last year we funded some very interesting research by an economist named Will Dobby. I was on a panel with him the other day who's using proprietary financial data to look at how different bank interventions to lower people's debt levels, whether or not that reduces bankruptcy for for families across the income distribution. And I elevate that particular piece of research because we're very interested in new data and sort of getting to new ways to think about these questions. The second is human capital, which we're looking at sort of very broadly across the generational arc. A lot of our funding in the first year was on early childhood, sort of taking seriously the idea that these inequalities that families have, that inequalities that play out across families affect children in very important ways that affect our future human capital, and we could be doing a lot more to think about that. And then, when we talk a little bit about family policy later in this conversation, I want to pivot back to that one. Innovation, invention, and creativity is the third, and which is sort of trying to understand entrepreneurship and innovation. I will note that last year we didn't fund any work in this space because we didn't get any proposals, so I thought that was very interesting. We're hoping to spur some this year. And then finally, governance. We have on our staff a sociologist, Elizabeth Jacobs, who worked with Jacob Hacker, and we're working with him to put together a conference in April looking at how inequality affects political institutions and governance. I work in Washington, D.C. This is a very interesting question. It's also the one that policymakers don't really want to talk about because no matter what we say, they really feel that they can't do anything about it. So trying to figure out how to actually have that conversation in a way that connects with policymakers in a way that they can hear, I think will be our big challenge.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. Barbara, you've written extensively on the expansion of non-standard work time. Can you tell us what you think are the most important trends in working time in the United States?
Yes, and I may dip into my 4 minutes, but I'll give back some later.
Okay.
So I thought about this question, and about 500 ways from Sunday to approach it. So I think my comments are going to resemble more a series of sound bites and deep analysis, but the connecting thread for me is the further embedding of a core periphery employment structure. So tying into Eileen's work, it's very interesting, and I have a big compliment to give you at the end of the session in private, by the way. Well, maybe later. But not only the commodification of firms, but the shift of focus from Main Street to Wall Street, and the role of financial fragility, these companies with high levels of debt relative to income and assets, has impacted and created great pressures to focus on short-run planning horizons. And most of the costs associated with short-run planning horizons is, of course, labor costs. And so what we see is flexibilization is one way to cut costs, especially when dealing with fluctuations in the market. So offshoring of manufacturing, union jobs were part of the drive to cut costs when profits level fall, as the golden age of capitalism, or perhaps the managed era of monopoly capitalism with its positive economic profits and high surplus value comes to a close. We see the beginning of the move toward stagnating wages overall, the rise of the ratio of executive pay relative to worker pay, and financial markets becoming the tool for solving the principal agent problems associated with corporate inefficiencies. We see the bifurcation of labor markets in new, yet curiously familiar ways. So the first piece of data came from the November 14 NLS survey of youth, 1979, and it talks about the mean number from 87 to 2010. The mean number of spells of unemployment for the general survey population was 5.4 episodes over that period. But more telling for the total population, 16.4% experienced 10 or more spells of unemployment from this period. But 32.9% of people with less than a high school degree experienced 10 or more spells of unemployment. Interestingly, 4% of those with less than a high school diploma had 0 spells of unemployment, while almost 9% with a bachelor's or higher had 0 spells of unemployment. So on the surface, this flies in the face of the rhetoric of high-end job hoppers moving around and moving up the ladder. And I am a data geek, and I am also very visual. I may have to pull that table back a little bit. So I did, that's not bad. I did have some tables prepared to talk about some of the trends. So one of the things that we can look at was this trend in part-time workers, which took a dip and then, accelerated during the recession. One of the pieces of how this contingent force is used to buffer the what's going on. Now, it's not going to come up very clearly. One of the biggest structural shifts we've seen in the economy is the move from the, of course, manufacturing, goods-producing sector to the service sector, and this chart is really cool. But the main point I wanted to make with that in terms of employment trends, the second largest employer in the U.S. today is a temporary service agency. Tying into that, so tying into the shift, which I think is really nicely illustrated in this, as we move from sectors that have more routinized work to sectors that the work is less routinized, has definitely facilitated this movement towards chopping up employee work time. The next one is a graphic on the professional business services, again, who went during the recession, so these are the outsourcing of different types of business services, and where the employment is growing and the recovery is in that sector. And although this is going to be kind of messy because it's not big, the one thing I wanted to note is that some of the largest growth in that professional services sector is in temporary employment. The other interesting piece was this look at a chart of self-employment. Now, often self-employment is touted as the acme of non-standard type work, where either it's an independent contractor or perhaps an entrepreneur starting up a business. And yes, and that carries its own set of baggage and precariousness with it as well. But we also see the decline in self-employment and this trend as well. So the bottom line that we can talk about is this trend of core periphery employment patterns and precarious employment feeding into the concerns about the growing impact of income inequality on families and the economy, the ability of individuals and households to plan effectively for retirement, and this is also amplified as retirement funds are also commodified, and then the wealth gap, which is at new record levels.
Thank you, Barbara.
Sliding this, it's a fun
Sliding.
No, this one, sorry.
Okay, we love technology.
Thank you, Barbara. I have a question that any panelists can feel free to comment on. America's working families. They're increasingly reliant on the wages and salaries of working women. Heather documented this brilliantly in the 2009 Shriver Report, A Woman's Nation Changes Everything. The World Economic Forum in Geneva recently published its 9th annual version of something called Global Gender Gap Report. The report covers economic participation, political empowerment, health, and survival. It also produces an overall global gender gap index. I'm going to read a partial quote from the report's press release. 9 years of measuring the global gender gap, the world has seen only a small improvement in equality for women in the workplace. The gender gap for economic participation and opportunity now stands at 60% worldwide, having closed by 4% from 56% in 2006 when they first started measuring it. Based on this trajectory, they estimate that with all else remaining equal, it will take 81 years for the world to close this gender gap completely. 81 years. So I wonder, should we consider this good news or bad news, and why?
So I would love to start answering this question, and don't let me talk too long, just kick me. Because I have 3 things I wanted to say about it. I love this question. So first, I want to point out in research that I actually did with Eileen and John Schmidt, I think it's important to always start a question about gender equity by noting that the economy needs women and their talent just as much as we need men's. In a paper that Eileen and John and I did, we calculated that about 11%, the GDP growth is 11% higher over the past few decades because of the increased participation of women in the U.S. labor force. That's a non-trivial number. Another number that I like to point to is some research by Peter Klenow and his colleagues, 3 of them, that found that between 1960 and 2008, the opening up of professions to women and minorities, so that's both women and people of color, added 20%, accounts for 20% of U.S. GDP growth over that time period. Again, non-trivial. But the 2 other points I wanted to make is that this kind of statistic scares me, especially in the U.S. context. I don't think we've made nearly as much progress as we need to in terms of gender equity in the workplace and the kinds of policies that make it possible for women and especially caregivers to fully participate. There's a lot of evidence and research that shows that, that those kinds of policies definitely improve women's labor supply and caregivers' labor supply. And we certainly haven't done all those things. We don't have paid sick days everywhere. We don't have paid family leave, lack of predictable scheduling, and the like. And this all gets to my main point, which is that 81 years is an incredibly long time. Most of us, all of us, dare I say, probably won't be alive unless they invent something new that helps us live that much longer. That's a very, very long time. And one of the things that I was very struck by after reading Thomas Piketty's book that I think it just really speaks to me in terms of this kind of statistic is that we've been seeing this rising income inequality across countries, across all these different countries within them and within the United States. And there is an argument that this is translating into increased wealth inequality. Neither of those trends bode well for the future of gender equality. If we are moving back to an era where today's high incomes will calcify into tomorrow's high wealth inequality, then those novels that I used to read as a girl by Jane Austen won't be something that I could be just like, wow, that's really wacky, that if I lived back then, I would have to focus on marrying well rather than actually becoming an economist. But if we live in a world where wealth again becomes the way that most wealth is, inheritance is the way that most wealth is created, then how that is passed down, it doesn't have to be from father to son, but if we still have that far to go, I fear that. So that is actually, I think, for me, Piketty has actually re-galvanized me in terms of thinking that there's a greater urgency to gender equality than ever before.
Thank you.
One of the worrying things about the closing of the gender gap, though it will take 80 years to do it, is because much of it is being closed because men's status is falling.
Yes.
So I'm quite worried about the decline in labor force participation of men as well in the United States. When I'm focusing on the gender equality, though, I think it is important to look at particular growing parts of the economy. And again, my expertise is around the people over 50 and beyond. The biggest increase in occupational growth is in caring labor, service work, home health care, and that's almost predominantly female. And it's the kind of care we saw actually in a paper yesterday, the kind of work that is especially detrimental to health. And we're finding that if workers have jobs at the age of 50 and above that have people have less control over decisions made by their workplace. They have less control over the pace and content of their work. Basically, if you're in a job at older ages that is subordinate levels, it affects your health all the way to the end of life, health, morbidity, independence. And given the patterns of gender division of the labor force, rather than just the gender patterns in pay and labor force participation in general, it looks as though women have less control on the job. There's certainly, to go back to my previous comments, less training on the job for women. And so I'm being kept up at night about the growing gap in health, morbidity, and longevity. I don't think most people realize that white women in the United States have less longevity gains than almost every group in the OECD. when I'm at conferences, people run up to me and said, "What is it with your white women in America? Everyone else is living longer, but the longevity gains have not accrued to women." In my work, I'm looking at actually women who have worked in the labor market and women who haven't. And when you control for wealth, it looks as though doing the double shift, from when you're 20 all the way up to 65, probably does foreshorten life expectancy and increase morbidity. So the gender division of labor at home and in the workforce actually makes the gender gap worse.
Anyone else?
I just have a factoid I'd like to throw out. And really, it builds on what Teresa has been saying. I mean, we have a declining employment to population ratio for prime age men. We have a declining employment to population ratio since 2000 for prime age women. And my favorite little factoid is that the employment to population ratio for women is higher in Japan now than it is in the U.S.
Wow.
Yes. People don't know that. Because they have been going up and we have been coming down and we have crossed. So
That is amazing.
I think your comments are really good responses to some of our colleagues in the other hotel who might say that, oh, laissez-faire, 81 years, if we just wait, it'll all go away, it'll be fine. And it's not going to be fine, and there are things we should do about it. I have a question for Heather. Heather, you have a long career on writing about balancing work and family or reconciling work and family. And last June, you and the Center for American Progress helped to plan the President's White House Summit on Working Families. So coming out of that summit, are there any new strategies or a new message that you think we should be emphasizing?
Well, it's somewhat ironic to ask this question right after the gender question, because I think that, so first, one of the things that a former colleague of mine who's now working in the White House, but she was working at the Center for American Progress during the 2014 election, after the election, she kept saying over and over again, 1 out of every 3 voters who voted in the 2012, not 2014, the 2012 election was a woman who voted for Barack Obama. So if you had, if all of us were voters, 1 out of every would have been women who voted for the Democratic candidate, was her point, which is a stunning number, which points to the fact that, closing the gender gap is become a more important political issue. But one of the things that we did at the summit and that the White House has been focused on is that these issues aren't just about women, they're about families. They're about families, communities, and that there is something very powerful in framing issues around gender equality as family issues that aren't just about benefiting women, but are actually about benefiting families. A couple of examples, David Wheel spoke at the LIRA plenary last night, and one of my favorite papers of his, he pointed out, it was the first time that I had noted it, so if other people thought of it before, but he pointed out to me in this article that the Family Medical Leave Act is one of the only new labor standards we've had in decades. And he goes to this whole argument that the reason that we got that new labor standard is because it wasn't just a labor standard that was supposedly just about unions or about men. It was because you're actually able to create a coalition that wasn't just about unions, but it brought in groups for the disabled and women's groups and children's groups and groups for older workers, really able to form a strong coalition behind a new standard. And that is the kind of argument and message behind the summit, is that we need to have a new agenda for working families that rethinks our labor market and social insurance policies. And it was very exciting because the president did say the words paid family leave, which was a massive accomplishment. So for those of us in Washington, having somebody say 3 words, really is a very big deal. Worked very hard on that, years of work. But we need to do things like paid leave, predictable scheduling, need to rethink, the Fair Labor Standards Act. It's awesome, but it really doesn't help us with a lot of the issues that you were just talking about. So how do we fix those so that they actually work for families? That's the big message and agenda moving forward, I think.
Families and households, right?
Yes.
Because families have to be related by blood or marriage, so.
Not in my imagination, but yes.
So it's about households.
It's about households.
It's about households, thank
Yes.
you.
And redefining the family.
And redefining the family, absolutely,
Yes.
as an institution. Eileen, one of the largest employers in the United States that was on Barb's slide up there is McDonald's. So thinking about McDonald's, which I never eat at, by the way, to anything from that to a Michelin-starred restaurant, I can't believe that a food service worker preparing a dish for a customer likely has no paid sick days and is forced to work when they are ill.
It is astounding.
I can't believe it. Can you give us an update on where we are in terms of paid sick leave laws and the
Sure.
paid sick leave movement in the United States?
Right, so of course, everybody who has been looking for optimism in the last year knows all about this. But the thing about these laws is that they cut across the political spectrum, and they cut across right-left differences. People who are conservative support them because they're family values, and people who want to facilitate the possibility for more gender equality in the home and at the workplace support them because they support gender equality. So it's really possible to get, the polling data on this is just phenomenal. I mean, every single group, every single demographic group overwhelmingly supports paid family leave and paid sick days. Every poll we've ever done shows that. And so we have been able to make great progress on this at the state and local level. In terms of paid family leave, we now have 3 states that have it, California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. We have many more states that are working on it, and one of the things that Heather didn't mention is that the president has managed to put together a pot of money for states that don't have it and want to think about how they could implement it and need some money for the startup costs. The 3 states that have it have had, if you don't live in one of those states, you probably don't know that we have states that have temporary disability insurance in this country. So if you're hit by an automobile on your way to work or while you're taking the kids shopping or anything else, and you're a worker, you can collect disability insurance from the state for up to for 26 to 52 weeks, depending on the state. So these are 3 states that already had that, and the paid family leave was an add-on. So there was not really much of an administrative burden getting it set up because the institutions existed for it. So having this fund that helps states figure out, okay, we don't have paid disability, how do we do it in our state? How, what will be the levels of taxation and so on? This stuff is, paid family leave is so cheap that it is astounding that we don't have it in every state. It costs at the top of the income distribution in New Jersey, which is the state I know well, best of all, it costs less than $50 a year. And it's proportional to your income, so low-wage workers pay even less than that. So there's no reason not to have paid family leave. The paid medical is a little bit more expensive because, well, if you're talking about 12 weeks, it won't be that expensive. The states that I'm talking about have 26 to 52 weeks. So it can be a little bit more, but in these states, workers pay it and are glad to have it. So I don't know that that's an impediment. On the paid sick days, we had a lot of victories this year. We now have 3 states and 17 cities that have paid sick days laws, and this includes 2 states and 11 cities that passed it in 2014. So that's where all that optimism. Every week you're reading some other state, some other city is doing something really great. Connecticut was the first state to mandate that workers could earn paid sick days. They have huge carve-outs in the Connecticut law, so it's great that they have it. The 2 main things that came out of it are what we know, and the reason that the restaurant workers don't have it is that so many of them are part-time. Really, when you look at full-time workers, most of them do have access to a couple of paid sick days a year. When you look at the part-time workforce, that's where you don't have it. And so the big pickup in Connecticut was in those industries and sectors, retail and so on, that have large numbers of part-time workers. However, there was a second carve-out, and that was for firms with fewer than 50 employees. It is really hard to find a restaurant with 50 employees. We went into, so we've traveled, if you know how we do the research, we do a survey, but then Ruth and I go out and travel around the state and talk to employers. And so anytime we were in the state, we would look for the biggest restaurant in that city or town and go to it and say, so how many people work here? And even those that had a restaurant and a bar so that they're running, long hours would have 20 people. So, this didn't quite solve the problem. New York City has just passed a really great paid sick days law, and we're going to go study that. In Connecticut, though, the second thing I wanted to say about Connecticut is that even if you have, this is astounding. In this country, there are many, many workers who have paid sick days coming to them, and who get a bad mark against their names if they actually use them.
Yes.
They get demerits. And if you accumulate enough demerits, 3 demerits in a 90-day period, you can be fired. If it's a different kind of company, it might be, more demerits before you get fired. But everything from disciplinary action to actually being fired for using the paid sick days that are in your employee handbook that say you have them. So the Connecticut law provides for no retaliation. And so even those who already had paid sick days benefit because the first 5 sick days that they use cannot be counted. As one employer said, why, they have 5 that they get for free. We can't begin to give them demerits until the 6th day, 6th time they take off. So, all right, well, whatever. But anyway, so there is that benefit even in Connecticut, part-time workers and the non-retaliation. But there will be millions of workers in New York City who will now have access to paid sick days that did not have it before. And we are really looking forward, Ruth and I, to doing that work. We have to wait for the law to be around long enough, so that employers have some experience with it. But that's what we're waiting for. In terms of, this year Massachusetts and California joined Connecticut as states that have it. And the cities that have it, I love to read the list: San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, Oakland, California, Seattle, Portland, Oregon, Eugene, Oregon, DC, New York City, and in my old home state of New Jersey, Paterson, Irvington, East Orange, Jersey City, Montclair, Trenton, Passaic, and Newark. So we have really made progress, and I'll talk later about the role that academics can play in this, but I'm
We've
very
seemed
happy
to
with
have
it.
made progress in the states with paid family leave,
Well,
New Jersey and California.
we have made a lot of progress in those 2 states, that's true.
Eileen brings up an important point about changing social policy and social insurance in the United States. It starts with the states. The guaranteed retirement account idea I had in my book had no progress in Congress, so it made more sense, much more efficient to build personal savings accounts, guaranteed retirement accounts on top of Social Security. But 17 states are passing or have passed legislation to create pensions for all workers in their state. The first one is California, and now it looks like we're going to do it in the city of New York, so that every private sector worker in that entity will be opted in, will be put in, automatically enrolled in a personal account with the option to be managed by the state pension fund or, this sounds familiar, the private exchange. But those administrators will all be regulated. But the bigger point is the one that Eileen made so well, is that we didn't pass Social Security, unemployment insurance, any kind of social policy without having some experimentation, in which Brandeis called, the little social experiments.
Or marriage equality, for that matter, as well.
Right.
Thank you. Barbara, your work with Lonnie Golden, Lonnie, it's really nice to see you here, very good work, has brought our attention to the prevalence of mandatory or forced overtime. Is that still a problem in post-Great Recession, or is it a problem for one sector or one part of the economy? And even if it's for a small sector or one part of the economy or certain groups of workers, it's still a practice. And I want to know how this practice presents obstacles to balancing work and family and integrating the labor force by gender.
All right, thank you. You added a couple of layers onto the question, but that's okay. My response to this question ties into a previous question that the other 3 people were talking about. So mandatory overtime is, of course, the antithesis of flexibility and control of working time. Now, given the cultural norms of women and their continued prevalence as primary caretaker of children, elders, and the home, lack of flexibility imposes hardships in any attempt to balance work and family. For women, then, it may mean some very tough choices, as the costs of giving up time dedicated to home care or hiring out for care and cleaning services means leaving the workforce is the only viable option. So leaving the job, then, in turn leads to fragmentation of work and career for women, which has been implicated by many researchers as key in the continued gendered wage gap. And so I would propose 81 years, maybe very optimistic. I'd say 162 if we were really lucky, just taking that into account. And I do have one more table to share. Thanks. It takes a village. So a friend of mine was telling me, oh no, it went
We'll get
away.
there. We'll find it.
Is it on slideshow?
Yes. Just turn, whoopsie, I'll have to just talk about it, I guess, computer.
We'll find it.
It's just a cool table.
Okay. Oh, well.
So, all right, so I'll make it up as I go along. So what I had is a table I had recycled from a presentation last year where Janice Peterson and I looked at changes in a couple of selected measures of control of work time from pre-recession to 2010. And so it was ability to, oh man, I need my prompts. To be able to change your work schedule if you have a family crisis, to be able to do that, ability to change hours, mandatory overtime. So there are 3 or 4 different measures. Now, what was particularly striking about these particular measures is that over that period, the mandatory overtime was about, on average, Lonnie, you're gonna have to help me out here, was about 23-ish% mean, about. Now, for men, it was like, I want to say 26, 19% for women, pre-recession. That reversed, it stayed the same for men, and we saw a big jump in mandatory overtime for women in the 2010 data. Similarly, and very interestingly, the ability to shift work time to meet family needs, it was fairly close for men and women, the ability to do that fairly easily prior to the recession. And for women, it fell off the charts in the 2010 data on the ability to adjust their schedules. So we're seeing some pressures on this control of work time, which is, I think, really a huge issue, and it ties into so many of these other pieces. So coupled with the uncertainty of the economy and current employment trends, I'm worried it'll take some rather sweeping structural changes to amend the trajectory of a core periphery workforce to where all of the workers can enjoy some element of control over the work time. Now, in parsing out some of the data on control over working time, there's very clear differences in employee control of hours by salaried, hourly, white collar, blue collar, pink collar, service sector, manufacturing, and of course the last 2 sectors often being gendered work.
Thank you, Barbara. My next question is for Teresa. Guy Standing says that labor market flexibility has undermined our identity as workers. It's almost as if we have these mini entrepreneurs running around from job to job to job to job. I want to know if you agree with him, and I want to know if this poses challenges for revitalizing the labor movement. How are unions responding to this labor market flexibility today?
So Richard Sennett also talked about this corrosion in character, as even employees are being used as temporary workers. So Guy Standing might be talking about the 1099ers or the people who take in boarders in the share economy and Airbnb, but also people with W-2s who are in employees are also feeling more temporary and less connected. In the industrial relations literature, we've talked a lot about the distinction in the law between being a worker and an employee. The employee, of course, is defined by the employer, and a worker is a self-identity. So I'm going to give you a surprise answer to that very well-prepared question. That if people's identity as a worker won't go away, everyone who doesn't have capital knows that they have to either capitalize their own job by renting out their bedroom or their car, or market themselves, or actually work for somebody else. And we are seeing, actually we have seen, and we will keep on seeing, those workers, all of us without capital to rely on, organizing. The freelance union is a really good example. Funded, of course, generously by the Rockefeller Foundation, founded by a former union organizer, Sarah Horowitz. But that gives an organized voice to the idea that workers will have to have some kind of collective action. So most certainly, having fewer employees that are trained or have tenure-weighted benefits on the employer and more job turnover will hurt the current union model. But we see in Seattle that the labor movement, the SEIU local in Seattle, decided to raise the minimum wage for workers at the airport and in the city rather than do it through collectively bargain. So my surprise answer to you, Deb, is that I think that workers are rising up and they will do collective action. It just won't look like an NLRB election and collective bargain. Even though there's good news on that front, it might be easier to have NLRB elections than it had been just last year because of some recent movement.
So Teresa, with a freelance union and the rise of freelance unions, legally, are we concerned about what the definition of an employer is, or is it going to be more craft-based, like Broadway musicians and stagehands that go from job to job?
Yeah. Again, I go back to the 19th century for my lessons for the future. That if you have, professional associations in this country have been a platform for self-help. So you don't organize against the man first. All you do is you organize for self-help. So there are a lot of examples of associations that pull together insurance, like the freelancers union are. I think the new unionization will be political action. You get sick leave in Montclair, New Jersey, rather than get it from your employer. You get an increase in minimum wage. You get increases in EITC. You fight for the first time in 30 years, fight to expand Social Security. I didn't think I would live to see it. Since 1983, we've only talked about retrenching Social Security. This is an amazing a development, and I think it's precisely because the employee definition has been weakened, but the worker definition will never go away.
Excellent.
People are organizing in that way.
Thank you. Excellent. This question is for our academics on the panel, and that is Barb and Teresa. How can academic scholars impact the policy world to advance and promote greater economic security and stability in the labor market?
Right. So there is a lot of research. It's quite interesting about how academics affect policy and advocacy. Lee, her last name is UMass Amherst.
Lee Badgett.
Badgett, yeah, is actually writing a book on this about engagement. That work, academic engagement in policy, is being funded by foundations. So it's a great question because there seems to be a rise up in recognition of the social responsibility of especially social scientists and especially economists to have policy relevant work. The main thing is that academics have to pay attention to what's going on in policy so they can research the right questions. And then we actually need a platform of communication and media to actually make the idea platformed out so that it can be refined. I've been doing this for 20 years, and without actually channels of transmission like the Economic Policy Institute, I would have never gotten from here in the classroom to actually the guaranteed retirement account. I needed those intermediaries. So that's my short answer to your question, is that we actually need think tanks and policy advocacies like the Economic Policy Institute and CPER in order to bridge it, or I think some of your ideas for your new organizations, but it's right on, it's a tradition. And academics should go into government and come back. I worked at the AFL-CIO for 6 months and it changed my life.
So you're suggesting that we think beyond academic journals, right?
Yeah, and if you go to the exhibits, all the acquisition editors are talking about the new kind of journal and the new kind of book. So we're finally getting it.
Do we need to write differently? Do we need to write better? Do we need to have to communicate to a wider interdisciplinary policy audience?
So we're starting a master's program at the new school called Applied Political Economy. And it has two elements that no other master's has, which is data visualization and actually a history of economic thought. We have an elective called rhetoric. And this actually came from our former president, former Senator Bob Kerrey, that said when he was a senator, he wanted economists who could talk and could communicate, and that they were worthless without skills at rhetoric. And rhetoric is now becoming more data visualization. So we're bringing our design school, the Parsons School of Design, to help our economics curriculum. So I'm building little policy economists at the same time.
That's great.
We have that responsibility as academics, is to build a new labor force.
You just want to get on Project Runway or something like that. Barb?
Yeah.
Well, I took a different track with my response. And I guess I started out rather tongue-in-cheek because I'm thinking of scholars in the fields of environmental change and how successful they've been at using data and scientifically sound research to sway legislators and public opinion towards policies that will take us back from the brink of, to the point of no return in terms of irreversible global changes. So so that's my starting point. I have to admit, I will wear the skeptic with the big S. Co-authors I've worked with, in particular Lonnie Golden and Janice Peterson, are far more conversant in policy prescriptions and implications and engaged in that arena than I am. I really am a data geek behind the scenes with a keen interest in all these issues. So I come at it from a little bit of a different point of view and what can the geeks behind the scenes do. So there's three key conundrums or issues in this whole thing this whole conversation I want to note before I jump off on to what I think is next. So 3 conundrums and issues: corporate culture and policy. So I'm thinking about the policies that many companies have. For example, you noted the paid sick leave, or in the case of flexible work time, where there's policies out there, but there's this huge stigma to using the flexible work time or using the days. You're not dedicated to the company. You're signaling that you are not dedicated and are not an up-and-coming rock star. The other thing about policies, and just like the financial sector, continues to this date to innovate around regulations, and where regulators are hard-pressed to even keep up with the innovations in financial markets. Employers and companies will continue to innovate or circumvent, in many cases, some of the very well-meaning policies. I think a second thing that makes labor policy very difficult is heterogeneity. And the heterogeneity of work, salaried, hourly, white collar, blue collar, pink collar, service sector, manufacturing, primary, secondary work, gendered work. So a policy that may be well suited for one sector may not address others. The third confounding factor is, again, flexibilization and precarious work. Excuse me. We continue to see companies with some of the most progressive work policies, with these flexible opportunities for flex time for their employees, but it's supported by these non-standard /periphery /flexible workers to make it feasible for their core workers to avail themselves of the benefits of this flexibility. Is there enough flexible staffing to cover that extra mandatory nursing shift? More flexible staffing creates more contingent and non-standard work. So, having been Debbie Downer or Barbara Bummer, first, I believe it is imperative for academic researchers to keep public policy discourse as honest as possible by collecting the data, conducting case studies, asking tough questions, and really importantly, disentangling the language that can obscure real issues and consequences, both intended and unintended. Researchers need to keep the challenges to women and groups with limited economic and political power in that conversation. Academics need to keep reminding us that policy is not enough and that institutional and cultural change has to be part of this conversation. As I was thinking about that statement, I had this visual image, and Heather, I really like that chapter you had on summarizing labor policy changes, and of course, often hand in hand with labor policy changes, especially as you look back over history, are other structural and social changes that go along with it. But sometimes when we think about, and you can think about it either way, either policy or the social change demanding policy change. One is like a parent dragging a screaming 3-year-old toddler behind them out to the car. And sometimes I think it shifts as to which is the parent and which is the toddler going screaming along with change. And the relationship of those challenges between policy and larger social and institutional changes is very difficult, and we see that played out in so many ways today. Labor history is replete with people making the supreme sacrifices for changes in working conditions over history, just as labor history is also replete with people making the supreme sacrifices for and on their jobs.
Thank you.
My 2 cents.
Eileen?
So I'm going to just talk about something a little bit different. As some people know, I was a professor at Rutgers University, and I directed the Center for Women and Work. I've been with Family Values at Work since it began, since its formation, and our New Jersey was one of the states. Our center was one of the organizations that was part of Family Values at Work. And what we discovered, how we have passed these laws in all of the places that we have, there's a certain mix of things that you need. You need the coalition that Heather talked about. You need a broad coalition that can show up at the governor's office, that can be in some square somewhere, that can come to the state legislature and make it clear that these are issues that cut across men, women, people of color, children, disabled. We had the public health workers, nurses. We had every kind of community you can imagine, the religious community. And we've been working very, very hard to keep expanding that coalition. Because there are many organizations, immigrant organizations, for example, that don't see things like paid sick days and paid family leave as their most important issue. Okay, it's not your most important issue, but it's going to help your folks. You have to be here on it. And we have come to understand that we have got to support them on their issues. It's not a one-way street. So there's a lot of, within these coalitions, thinking about how to support each other's issues. So we need that big coalition. We are now much more able than we were when California and New Jersey first passed paid family leave to involve the business community. There are several organizations of businesses that provide these things for their own workers and are willing to speak out on these issues. And this has been tremendously important in showing that the NFIB or the Chamber of Commerce does not speak for all businesses. So the coalition now includes, we've always tried to include business, and I won't mention the numbers that we had for California. I will never tell how many businesses we had on board for that, but we had enough to do the interviews with the press. New Jersey, we were already doing better. By Rhode Island, we're over the top and all the paid sick days. We have lots of business partners, so that's the coalition. The second thing you need is an ally that knows how to lobby state legislatures. And this is usually your state fed, if you are a northern state and have a state fed.
And Labor Federation.
Labor Federation, the AFL, or in some places, New Jersey, not only did Change to Win and the AFL not come together, but the
Worker Families Party.
And I'm thinking of the old labor groups. We still have the Central Labor Councils and whatever that never belonged. Anyway, right. We have lots of labor groups that we were able to involve. Their involvement is important, and the other group that does a great job will never join a coalition, but will provide you with resources that you can't buy because you never have enough money, is the AARP. They are a fabulous partner on all of this. They lend you their website, they lend you their list of how you can easily contact your state legislator, and it's invisible to the person using it. You think you have gone to, the Family Values at Work, or in our case, the Time to Care Coalition, but really, it's the AARP that has the engine behind it, and who knows how to lobby. So you need a partner or partners who can do that. But the third thing that you need are academics who can translate the research that has been done on these issues into one-pagers or briefing papers or things, people in the state legislature, they usually won't read things that are more than 1 page long, but definitely not more than 3 pages long. And you have to have academics with the standing of being a professor or an associate professor or assistant professor somewhere who understands the literature, who can translate it into terms that people can understand. Every single one of the coalitions that has been successful has had that. Sometimes they're social scientists and sometimes they're lawyers. They're not always, they're not always us economists, but you have to have that. You can't do it otherwise. How do you explain to the state legislature that this will not be bad for business? Here are the benefits to people. I mean, all of the research that we know about has to be in their hands in a format in which they can understand it. They have to be able to call a hearing where you have a worker who needs it, you have a company that says we've done it, and you have an academic that says it's not going to kill business in your state and it's going to do a lot of good things for your constituents. So there's that kind of a role for academics, which not enough people, I think, step up to the plate to do. But in every state where we have been, and city, where we have been successful, we have had academic partners who can't lobby, we never go to speak unless we're invited, but we can be invited to testify. We can put out one-pagers, we can put out briefing papers, and this is a really important part of what we can do.
Thank you, Eileen. Let me add, as a resident of the state of New Jersey, that you are a model, and you should be thanked. And I'll also give a shout out to Michelle Naples from the College of New Jersey for why we have paid family leave in the state of New Jersey.
Michelle was there back in the days when
So
you could
thank
hardly,
you.
hardly
Thank
make
you.
progress, and has done great. She did great.
So Heather, you're in the policy world. What do we academics need to know about the practical politics of how to build support for change? What can you teach us?
Well, so that is such a tough question, and I think some of my answer, I mean, everybody sort of said some things that I might have touched on, but I had a couple of things that, when I was thinking about this question, what I wanted to sort of note. I mean, one, it's, so what is it that academics have to offer, right? What do you have, right? What do you bring to the table? So for the most part, what academics bring to the table is a deep understanding of the literature, like what do we know about this issue generally, whatever it is, the labor market, the economy or something. A lot of technical skills and data, you can crunch numbers, incredibly helpful. And then third, and what Eileen just alluded to, credibility. And that's where things get a little bit tricky because this was a positive. There's a lot of sort of positive stuff that I was hearing from you guys on how to engage. And let me just be a little bit of some of the challenges, right? When you want somebody to come and testify on paid sick days, you do not want somebody, it is not helpful for the policymaker to have the economist show up and say, well, on the one hand, it might be good, but on the other hand, it might not be good. And well, we don't really know, and I can't make any conclusions because, I don't have the perfect, whatever it is. Paid sick days is probably not the best example for that. But the reason that academics...
Raising the minimum wage.
Yeah, raising the minimum wage, yes. And the reason that academics are like that, right, is because we are, putting my academic hat on for a moment, ask questions, right? We're researchers. We want to it's a search for the truth. It's not like, oh, I have the truth and I'm going to go out and tell you what it is. There's this really deep tension in there. So I think one of the most important things is figuring out how to get yourself over that hurdle so that you can be useful. So that the depth of knowledge about the field and the data and expertise and methods that you could bring to the table, somehow figuring out, and I think this is actually very individual, like how getting past whatever those credibility hurdles are for yourself so that you could actually say something in one pages, because it's not saying everything on the one page. What the policymaker wants to see on the one page is, here is the problem, and here, policymaker, is what you need to do to fix it. And what I often tell folks, and I will note, a lot of what we're trying to do at Equitable Growth is to connect policymakers and academics. So we definitely will hope to be a hub for that as we grow and move forward. And I will also note that we have a small research staff, that most of our people are in communications, editorial assistants, ghostwriting. We've been reaching out to a lot of people in our network, and happy to talk to anybody who's interested. And I have this editor, he ghostwrites things, it's great, op-eds, columns, but making things accessible. But that takes somebody who's willing, who has that interest in both working on those writing skills, but also the humility to do that. But getting back to this credibility, point, being able to say to the policymaker, like pretending, right, if the president, no matter who the president is, like comes to you and says, what should I do, right? Like if you put yourself in their shoes and you have to actually act, what is the best knowledge and data to the best of your ability, and that's what you need to say. And you can put your little caveat at the footnote, but just sort of put yourself in their shoes and know that they have to vote. They don't have three hands. So I think that actually would be the most useful thing. The second thing, the other big thing that I will note, many, many years ago, when I was at the graduate student in the New School, Marlene Kim came and gave a talk. And I remember the room that I was sitting in, because she said this life-altering little sentence, which was, if you want to do research that is useful, you might want to go out and ask people what they would find helpful. And I was like, that is probably the most insightful thing anybody said to me in my entire career. I was like, wow, that's a really good idea. So, I mean, if you are interested in an issue, there are tons of advocacy groups. There are people who are working on the issues that can help you figure out what actually might be an interesting question or one we need answered. About every year or so, I'll go to the Hill and I'll talk to people on the various committees we work with. And I'll just go and be like, so what do you want to know? And I'll just take lists. Now, I don't answer most of those questions, and most of them are impossible for social scientists to answer. But it means I always have a list of, like, here's things that might be helpful. And when I find somebody's written a paper on that, then I know, I can just send that to them, because they'll find it's useful. But I'm not claiming that I know what to ask. It's that it's finding people that can help you get those questions. What would be helpful?
Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you.
yeah, it's long.
A little footnote, and then I have my last question for everybody. Do you remember Harry Truman was so upset when economists used to come into the Oval Office and say, well, on the one hand this and on the other hand that, and he is supposedly have said in frustration, well, somebody please bring me a one-handed economist. So my last question for everybody, and your answers in a phrase. I'd like your answers in a phrase, and then we'll open up the dialogue so that others can join the conversation. We can't go back to the golden age. So I'm going to give you a magic wand, hypothetical magic wand. Assume a magic wand. We can make assumptions. I want to know, if you could pass one labor market policy, what would it be? Teresa.
Full employment, employer of last resort. Sorry, I knew I was going. I pressed the button first. We get a lot of improvements in labor market structures, in permanent employments, tenure-weighted benefits, everything when we have tight labor markets.
That was mine. You could read it for yourself.
I did it.
What's your backup?
Well, then I would go to a more micro policy growing out of the work that I've been doing on private equity, and I would limit the amount of debt that can be put on a company. We have now, in the wake of the financial crisis, limited the amount of debt that banks can lend to a company to 6 times earnings, which is pretty high to begin with. But private equity can go into the shadow banking market, a shadow banking system, and load them up with 7 or 8 times earnings. The fragility is huge. So if I had, since debt is the lifeblood of this industry, and if we want to make it a more sensible industry, we need to be able to limit the amount of debt they put on companies.
Okay, full employment.
Tax it, right? Tax it. It's on tax. Yeah.
Well, it is tax.
Yeah.
We could fix the tax, but actually that wouldn't do the whole. That wouldn't do the
So
whole
full
thing.
employment, limit debt. Barb?
Well, we're playing a little bit of prisoner's dilemma here.
Yeah.
I went with true universal health care.
Yes.
Sure, yeah. Single payer.
Heather?
So
It's just a tough question
It
for
is-
a policy one.
it is. So I would, depending on my mood, I think I would rethink in a way that worked the Fair Labor Standards Act to actually reflect today's workplaces. And if I couldn't do that one, I would rethink the Social Security Act. So it'd be one or the other.
I would
I just
choose
took a twofer.
rethinking the Social Security
Great.
Act, and I think we need to raise the base to infinity
Yeah?
and lower the rate.
And add paid family leave.
Add paid family
Lower
leave,
the rate.
absolutely. Yeah, raise the rate to infinity, lower, so,
Raise the base.
raise the
Raise the
cap
base.
to infinity, lower the rate.
Well, lower the rate, broaden the base.
Yes.
That's the way
Lower
they,
the rate, broaden the base.
for those of you who don't follow the right wing on corporate tax, or that's like what they say. Lower the rate, broaden the base. That's all they do.
Thank you to the panel, and we will like to invite you now to enter this conversation and dialogue with us about labor market flexibilization and public policy. Ann?
Wonderful panel, thank you very much, great question. I just had a question, are you assuming flexibilization, or if we did all these things, would we reverse flexibilization and lead to overall security?
Can I jump on that?
Yes.
So I think why Barb said universal health care is that the idea that people are attached to their employer, would make actually employment less important and the cost of job loss smaller.
Well,
Right?
that's exactly right. It
Yeah.
would take some of the sting out of the precarious employment because a
Yeah.
lot of people want 20-plus hours a week for those healthcare benefits. And it might enable in a more positive way, a more positive visioning of a core periphery workforce.
The problem is that you don't get a lot of training outside of an employment relationship. So that's one
that's-
form of very important human capital that you can't get in a precarious situation.
Well, let me play the devil's advocate
Okay.
on that. So as I was thinking about this question and thinking about universal health, true universal single-payer
Yeah.
health care, it would take that out of the equation for companies, and they could compete for their workers using something other than healthcare benefits. And one of those bases of competing for workers could be training.
Absolutely.
It might free up some funding to pay for worker training and more internalization of these kinds of processes.
Great research question.
Yes.
Most of what we've been talking about has been about evidence-based policy. Again, it's assembling the evidence, transmitting it to legislators who are interested in the evidence and basis for reaching rational policy decisions. But we are in a political environment in which there's an enormous amount of denial, of resistance to evidence. Evidence-based policy is not what a lot of the legislators, a lot of people in the political unit are about. They're about misleading, perhaps, advancing ideological positions, making sure initially in 2008 that Obama would be a one-term president. Well, that didn't work, but I mean, this is the thing. There's a political environment in which all this very constructive activity is going on, but it seems to me it's up against enormous limits or obstacles in this current social environment. And I wonder how do you have ideas about coping with that?
Well, I have a comment on that. Maybe I have ideas on coping on it. So when we were, when I was reaching out to people last year about setting up this center, I reached out to a lot of economists, hundreds of people that I talked to one-on-one. And one of the things that I that I kept saying is that, well, in Washington where I work, we have this supply side mantra where basically tax cuts are given as the solution to every problem, and inequality is good, and therefore you shouldn't do anything about it because it's inefficient. And this is and that everything that I've ever thought was a good policy idea is a quote-unquote job killer. So it always sort of end with this statement. And I kid you not, there were at least 5 people who thought I was being hyperbolic. And I was like, I am not being hyperbolic. You are out of touch. You person, they were all men. So you man, economist, academic person, you're out of touch. And I take from that, and I also would point people to, Theta Scotchbull has been putting together this fantastic new resource called the Scholars Strategy Network, which is over almost 400 scholars now. Anybody can join. All you have to do is write up 2 pages on your research, and She has all of this stuff. She has groups in all these different states. But that sort of is from a sense that, yes, we are living in an era that is not evidence-based. It's usually a fact-free zone. But I would argue that is in no small part because academics, especially economists, have washed their hands of the whole thing. My frustration with the 300 economists is that if you can't get a straight, we pay all this money, these people, they teach at public institutions and can't actually give policymakers useful advice and counsel and aren't engaged. So I'm sorry if I'm sounding a little bit angry, but I'm at this conference where there's like 12,000 people, and all of them should be engaging in it should be engaging in some way, and they aren't. We don't want all of them to. I don't know, but
Lots.
but I do think so. I take your point, but I think it's been the abdication of people who have a responsibility to engage and so that's the only way, and that's quite frankly, it's the only way out of it. We're not going to fix it unless those of us say, hey, do it differently.
I am actually kind of following up to that question, and my question is actually directed to Dr. Appelbaum, because you had said that we need allies that can convince businesses the policies aren't bad for them. And my question is kind of twofold in that, what do we do when a policy is in fact bad for business? And then also, following up to what Dr. Boushey has just said, for example, I went to the American Finance Association meeting yesterday, and Ricardo Correa from the Federal Reserve Board got up and he was talking about the say-on-pay laws and how they are not bad for business. That does not affect business. So somebody got up, I don't remember the name of the commentator on his paper, but totally tore the paper apart. I mean, he came last, and so I was able to see what the response was for the first few papers, and his response was basically, kind of a brush aside of the conclusion of Korea's conclusion that it wasn't bad for business, and he was, and I understand that the point of getting up and commenting on something is to critique it, but it was I think a noticeable sort of vendetta, I think, against what he had concluded. So I'm curious about your reaction to that, for example.
So I have a two-part answer to your question. The first is I myself do not go around making the business case for these policies. I don't care whether if pay family leave makes some businesses profits less than they were before, I still want pay family leave. So I myself don't make that business case. In terms of the research, Ruth and I are always looking for what might be a problem. Suppose that the record keeping turns out to be a much huger issue for business than anyone anticipated. We would then like to have that information. We would like to go back to policymakers and say, how do we deal with this? This is a problem for business. We actually always include, both in the surveys and especially in the interviews that we do, probing for what might be the problems, what might be the issues, what is not working for you in this that could have worked better. So far, so far what we have found, you have to think about the policies in the U.S. We're talking about 5 paid sick days a year, and I can tell you that actually on average, if you count the full-time workers in Connecticut, workers on average had 7 paid sick days a year. The average number of paid sick days used was 4. Employers we only survey employers because we know the employees would love it and we don't have enough money to do everybody. Then the employers tell us that 1/3 of their employees make no use of paid sick days in any given year. So it's a non-event for them. We're not talking about anything major. And so this is what we find over and over again, and we have to keep finding it. A different group found it in San Francisco, but everybody said, well, that's San Francisco. How would it work in someplace else? So we're always we're doing these things just to find out that it's a non-event for employers. And this is the other reason you need academics engaged. There is an industry out there that creates research that really will never pass a test that any academic would apply. It's just not any, in Connecticut, they went out and they asked employers what their perception of what the law might do to them would be. Would you raise your prices? Would you fire your workers? And then they published that. 37% say they will fire workers, 42% say they'll reduce hours. Okay, so we go out a year and a half later and we say, okay, so how's the law affecting you?
Yeah.
You know, and we don't find those kinds of results. I'm not
That's
saying.
such a good design.
I'm not saying that
Such a
there's
good
no
design.
cost to any employer. That would be ridiculous. Obviously, if you have a large part-time workforce and now you do have to have a couple of paid sick days and people use 3 or 4 of them a year, you have a cost, but it's not major. It's not major. It's less than the increase in the rent that you're paying. So,
Yeah.
you know, I'm not saying these things are costless. I'm just saying that they're well within the capacity of businesses to handle them, and they tell us, hey, didn't really have much of an effect on me.
Inspired by Eileen, one thing that I've been doing recently is going through. There's some places where people have compiled quotes that business leaders have said against these various pieces of legislation, and going back to the ones from 5-10 years ago, and actually then Googling the employer to just see, well, what happened? Did your business fold? I've yet to find one where that has happened, and but it's a really fun exercise. It's
a
like,
great
oh
design.
no, your business, it's still thriving. Well, who knew? Who knew?
Yeah.
Yet you said that you said unequivocally to the San Francisco whatever that you would fold. So anyway.
Who knew you admired Jon Stewart, Heather? Who knew?
Yeah.
David?
What I notice is the work speed. When I go to Starbucks, which I do sometimes, I say to the mostly younger women who are, well, you're working too much. And I just wonder, there seems to be very little protest about that. I'm worried about the passivity. So I just bring that up, and it's incredible. I tell them that when I was younger, you wouldn't have to work that fast. And it seems to affect it too much. So I just would raise that. And also at McDonald's, I unionize. And by the way, I still go there, even though I got inspired to bad taste. But anyway, I just thought you'd comment on that. The work speed up issue to me is quite serious.
I think that's true.
Yes.
I want to put down the academic contribution to it, because I know, at least in my experience, there are a lot of legislators who are desperate for academic research on their topic. And I also find in the work I've done on minimum wages and living wages that there are contrary studies. And I've experienced recently going with the mayor of Los Angeles the other time to the Trail Board, discussed the $13.25 minimum wage would be. And I was doing my research and so on, and some person, a woman, who said, in the Times board, why should I believe you? I could
Yeah,
find
that's right.
another economist who said the exact opposite.
Yeah, that's right.
And I had, on the spur of the moment, I came up with the reasons why my studies were better than others. And when she says, yeah, have you ever changed anyone's mind? I said, yeah, Christy Romer's. And then she asked me to participate in an op-ed debate. So I was just going to say that in terms of what academics can do, it's not just to do a study, remember, that there was literature then, but also to be able to teach policymakers, journalists, everyone else, the difference between gun science and real science.
Very good. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I'm Larry Seidman, University of Delaware. I just thought it was doing a great panel, and why did they put you so far down away from the main center? But anyway, I just wanted to second that call for universal health care, single payer. Suggest, I like to call it Medicare for all, because Medicare is a program, improved Medicare, which has worked for 50 years. It's not some foreign program, some new experiment. And as far as roles of academic, one of the reasons I come to these conferences, and I'm one of the few people doing it, I hand out policy articles that I have. And I've got 2 articles on the economist's case for Medicare for all, which I'd love to give out to any people that are interested, but I feel kind of presumptuous to go around. There's very few of these economists seem to be trying to get practical policy to other economists and participants. So, but I'm doing it anyway.
Good for you. Did you have a question?
One of you mentioned building coalitions, including state immigrant groups, might say that your legislation is not their highest priority and so forth. And there's a wonderful book by Emilio de Mora called the Mexican American Worker in Texas that gives a very granular view of how employers play off Mexican heritage Texans and Mexican Americans, legal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, against native-born Anglo background workers in Texas in the early part of the 20th century. And it seems like that tension has only escalated today and cuts across a very wide range of occupations. And I say this as someone who thinks that a large immigrant component in the academic workforce is a big part of the vitality of American academia, so I support fairly open door. But you could talk about building a coalition, but in fact, employers have been very successful at building tensions between, native-born workers, and I just don't hear that as part of the agenda at all.
Well, we have been successful. I'm not part of the group. It's enough to be part of the group that focuses on research, but there is a group that focuses on coalition building, and we meet every year in December at the Ford Foundation, one person per organization, and we used to fit around a table, and now we need their biggest auditorium. But I was really impressed this time by the number of women and men from immigrant groups that came, people of color that came. It's taken years of trying to figure out how do you do this outreach, how do you reach across these barriers, how do you say we will support you on your issues, this is an important issue for you as well. I'm astounded at the work that people who have been doing this coalition building have actually accomplished, but it's been years.
Yes.
Regarding getting academics involved in policy for non-tenured teaching faculty, your perceptions of the lack of incentives or disincentives to get involved?
Yeah. Well, basically, I would not encourage any untenured faculty member to get involved in this. I mean, I had the Center for Women in Work. I try to help them raise funding for their research, and I said, later on, you owe us back.
Yeah.
But I would not, given the world that we all live in, I would not encourage them to get involved.
That's part of so we are a grant-making institution, are focusing on our grant-making on younger scholars for a reason, so that we can help cultivate that next generation. But, I mean, I would concur with Eileen. I was thinking more about folks who
I don't know.
seem
I don't do it all for me.
Doesn't?
For the economics department, love policy.
Oh, more power to you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love your econ department, but that's.
Well, it is, and it's a lot more database. I mean, I think that some of it is, it's how are you advocating?
Cutting edge.
Yeah, are you advocating a policy, or are you doing research that's cutting edge with using new data on some new policy area? Those are two, yeah.
So what's your advice to people who are untenured regarding if they're interested in policy and being an advocate, but also having a good career, how they manage themselves in that process up to the point where
Do what Aaron Dubé did.
Yeah, I think problem-oriented research is what you want to be doing.
Yeah.
And at some point, you will have the credibility to engage in the debates.
I think another piece of that would be for the younger researchers to align with the organizations that are supportive, and maybe not so much with other organizations that aren't interested in policy at all, won't support it, and don't have venues for publishing. There are organizations out there that will help untenured faculty publish their work.
I don't think it's an easy answer. I think this is where the economist answer of "it depends" is probably a better answer. I would say it's individually and institutionally based, that you need to seek out mentors at your own institution, and if you wind up getting an op-ed piece placed in the New York Times, I can't imagine how that wouldn't help your tenure case, for sure. So I think it's institutionally and individually based.
Sorry. I hate to shoot that down. It wouldn't count for anything at our institution.
Well,
That's
it's
That's your point about it being institutional.
yes,
based.
yes, it depends, and it would be a plus thing. I'm certainly not a substitute for a journal article, but plus. Anyone else? So we,
Somebody else.
over here?
This
this is something I don't think you've touched on, but anyone could answer. What do you think, do you think there's a relationship between everything you've been saying and the culture of unpaid internships for recent college graduates or even graduate, postgraduate students, and that flexibility and uncertainty?
Yeah, well, I'll connect what I said. The fact that we don't have full employment is making it easy to degrade the labor standards of workers, including what we call interns. The work at Economic Policy Institute has, and the attention of legislature about what is an illegal intern has changed probably the lives of 35 students that I know of. Because they've gone to their employer and they will not work. So it's, again, it's just another low-paid labor market. But one thing that would help in these two areas is for economists to actually look at their own industry, academic, and actually apply these questions about the quality of the barbells, structure of our labor force. Because as we get more tenure and higher pay and reduce our course load, that all comes on the backs of either graduate student labor, or it comes on or unorganized teaching assistants or research assistants or adjuncts. So we really will have made progress if we have sessions at the AEA that has to do with an analysis, industrial organization analysis of higher education, the demand, student loans, and whatnot. The second thing I wanted to say, as I didn't pitch in about mentoring assistant professors to get the prize tenure and their policy advocacy, is that I agree with Michael Reich and what at Berkeley is at our institution and everywhere, because every assistant professor does want to make good and have an influence. Just presume that of all of your workers, including your assistant professors. So what we've done in my policy shop, I direct the Center for Economic Policy Analysis, a center that was founded by David Gordon, by the way, that we seek to bring in heterodox economics into mainstream policymaker using peer-evaluated research. So the standard is academic review, but the mission is to bring an economic framework to mainstream policymakers. So I tell everybody on the way up that the only way you're going to hone your research question is if you talk to policymakers, advocacy groups, and what Michael said, really important place to get questions and to sharpen your viewpoint is to talk to journalists. Because they, just like you said, Heather, they will ask the questions that need to be answered, and those questions from good journalists often stump an academic, that they just don't realize they have the answer in a way that will pass muster. So I encourage, as part of our training and curriculum, an engagement from the very beginning, but to speak to their own goals to advance their own careers. Otherwise, to do it as your service mission, it won't work. It has to be in their academic and research and publication mission.
Excellent. I'm going to bring this panel to a close by thanking the panel for an excellent dialogue, and thank you for participating in dialogue with us about labor market flexibility.
And Deborah, this panel worked because of your well-chosen questions. Thank you.
So we have to run because we're in another panel in another hotel.
Yeah, in Rhode Island.
Oh, in Rhode Island. Wow. Oh, I am done running.